Well, good evening and welcome to the Sandwich Public Library District. My name is Matthew Jones and I am the Adult Services Coordinator here at the library. We want to welcome you to this very special webinar that we're able to host tonight. Reach for the Stars, a day in the life of NASA. We have an extremely special guest coming to us tonight, and that is Mr. Jeffery Woytach. And he, of course, as you have heard, and the reason you're here is because he is a NASA engineer, and he's going to share his story with us, as well as make time to answer some of the questions that you might have. So let me give you a couple instructions about how you can participate tonight. If you are able to see at the bottom of your screen a Q&A box, that is where you can leave any questions at any point throughout the session. And then at the end of Mr. Woytach's talk, I will ask some of those questions on behalf of the group. And in the meantime, in the chat box, you should be able to leave there your name and how many folks are viewing with you. If you do leave your name there, I will write them down on a slip of paper. And then before we go tonight, we're going to have a drawing. And let me just show you here. We have an awesome box of NASA swag here. I don't know if you can see all that's in here, but you will be representing very well your support for NASA. And so please do leave your name in the box there. And we want to make sure that you get an opportunity to take some of that home with you next time you come to the library. So those are the instructions I have. Again, we are truly honored here at the Public Library to be able to welcome our guest tonight. Mr. Woytach, thank you so much for your time. Thank you so much for being willing to interact with us here face-to-face online. And we are absolutely soaring with excitement to hear your story. So I'm going to turn it over to you.
All right, Matthew, thank you very much. I appreciate it. I appreciate your kindness. Good evening, everyone. That is a substantial package of NASA items there. That is really good, Matthew. I'll congratulate in advance whoever ends up winning that. That looks really good. Well, as Matthew said, my name is Jeff Woytach. I work at the NASA Glenn Research Center in Cleveland, Ohio. You see my contact information on the screen here. We will leave time for questions at the end of this presentation, as Matt said. So you can enter your questions in the chat and we'll answer them at the end. But if there's anything you think of afterwards, you can feel free to send me an email at my NASA email address shown there, and I will be happy to answer your questions. Also, if you'd like copies of this presentation, just let Matt know and he can forward it to you. Okay, Matt, if you could advance to the next slide. The National Aeronautics and Space Administration consists of NASA headquarters in Washington, D.C., plus 10 field centers across the country, of which the Glenn Research Center in Cleveland is one of those. You can see them all listed here. There are a number of facilities that, strictly speaking, are not NASA centers. The Jet Propulsion Laboratory, JPL, in Pasadena, California, actually is part of the California Institute of Technology and works under contract to NASA. It is not a NASA center. The same is true for the Applied Physics Lab at Johns Hopkins University in Maryland. They are also a contract operator for NASA. And of course, everyone is familiar with the missions across the solar system that JPL does. And Johns Hopkins has also done many missions for NASA, including the New Horizons mission that flew past Pluto a number of years ago. Next chart. The Glenn Research Center in Cleveland actually consists of two campuses. Lewis Field, which is at Cleveland Hopkins International Airport. It's on about 350 acres and has a little over 3,000 civil servants and contractors. But we maintain a second facility about 50 miles west of Cleveland in Sandusky, Ohio. That's the Neil Armstrong Test Facility. It's on over 6,000 acres, but has very few people because it only has a few facilities that are meant for testing very large spacecraft and actually does rather dangerous testing. Fueled upper stages with liquid oxygen and liquid hydrogen, for instance. We'll be talking a little bit about this facility in a little while. Next chart. Glenn specializes in a number of things. Air-breathing propulsion. The center began, of course, as an aeronautics facility. Glenn Research Center is actually one of the 3 original NASA centers. When NASA was formed in 1958, it was created by President Eisenhower from another agency, the National Advisory Committee on Aeronautics, NACA. NACA was founded in 1915 by the Wright brothers. The center was first called the Lewis Flight Propulsion Research Laboratory, named after one of the first leaders of NACA, George Lewis. And of course, when NACA became NASA, it became one of the 3 original NASA centers. The groundbreaking for the center occurred in January of 1941. That means this year is the 80th anniversary of the Glenn Research Center. So air-breathing propulsion has been our heritage and continues to be one of our fortes, but we also do major work on in-space propulsion and cryogenic fluids management, how to handle liquid oxygen and liquid hydrogen, which stored at temperatures of 400 degrees below zero, and how to manage those in space. We do physical science and biomedical technologies in space. The primary exercise facility on the space station was designed and built at the Glenn Research Center in Cleveland, and we're working at ways to assure that astronauts remain healthy for the long voyages to Mars and back home to Earth. Communications technology and development is one of our specialties. We're currently looking at ways of doing laser communications from deep space, so you can have enormous data rate capabilities from as far as Mars. Power systems, energy storage and conversion systems, everything from solar arrays and flywheel power systems to nuclear fission power systems, and different types of batteries for different applications. We also specialize in materials and structures for extreme environments. We have a test facility that can test materials and electronics in conditions that simulate the surface of Venus, which is an atmosphere 90 times denser than the Earth's atmosphere and a temperature on the surface approaching almost 900 degrees Fahrenheit. Next chart, please. A little bit about myself. I'm originally from northeastern Pennsylvania, a very small town called Scranton. I classify myself as a space cadet because sometime when I was in the 1st grade, I became enamored of space exploration by reading a series of very small black and white books, serialized books about a boy and his dog exploring the moon. And I also had the opportunity to grow up during the Apollo missions. I was in 1st grade when Neil Armstrong took his first step on the moon. And I also had another inroad. The town where I was from, Scranton, was about 5 miles away from another very small town called Old Forge, Pennsylvania. Old Forge was the birthplace of Glynn Lunney, one of the Apollo flight directors. And I began corresponding with him when I was in the 5th grade. He used to always return my letters, always answered my questions, and he always sent me lots of real good NASA information, most of which I still have to this day. I graduated from high school in 1979. I went to Penn State University. I graduated from there in May of 1983 with the Bachelor of Science degree in Aerospace Engineering. I interviewed with the NASA Lewis Research Center, as it was called then, in Cleveland in February of 1983. I was offered a position and accepted it in March, and I started working here in June of 1983. And this June will be my 38th anniversary of working at the center. Next chart, please. These are just some of the programs and activities that I've done at the center. I worked on an experimental communications satellite, which we launched on the Space Shuttle Discovery in 1993. At that time, the center managed the Atlas and Titan Centaur launch vehicles for NASA. I was ascent trajectory lead for 2 weather satellites that we launched for NOAA in 1994 and 1995. I then had the opportunity to work with the Russians. We were working on an experimental power system that would have been placed on the Russian Mir space station. From then, I started working on items for the U.S. space station, the International Space Station. Did 8 pieces of hardware, actually 9 pieces of hardware for the station, which I'll talk about in just a little bit. And a number of other items that you see here, which I'll give you a little bit more detail about in further charts. Next slide. This is a photograph of the Advanced Communications Technology satellite I was talking to you about. The picture on the left is the spacecraft attached to its upper stage inside the shuttle payload bay. Give you an idea of what you're looking at here. The spacecraft in the upper stage was about half of the shuttle bay, so about 30 feet long, about 15 feet wide, and total weight was about 35,000 pounds at launch. You see a few items there with circles on them. ACS was part of a $500 million mission, and that was in 1993. By today's standards, it probably would have been a $2 billion spacecraft. And we were the first users of this particular upper stage on the space shuttle. So I was the lead for making modifications to the spacecraft that would allow it to be recovered on another shuttle mission if there was some failure of that upper stage that stranded the spacecraft in low Earth orbit. In the middle, you see one of the logos for the ACS mission. That was designed by me way back in 1988. Next chart. I mentioned the center managed the Atlas and Titan Centaur launch vehicles for the agency. We managed well over 100 launches for NASA, including the Viking landers to Mars, the Pioneer spacecraft, the Voyager spacecraft that have all since left the solar system, the Cassini mission that spent quite a number of years in orbit or in the Saturn system. And you see circled there the GOES I and J missions, of which I was the ascent trajectory lead for both of those. Next chart. I mentioned I was working with the Russians. You can see the logo there for the Solar Dynamic Flight Demonstration mission we were working on. It would have been the first 4-person extravehicular activity to install this on the Crystal module of the Mir space station. Would have been 2 astronauts and 2 cosmonauts. Unfortunately, the Russians couldn't afford to do Mir and their participation in the International Space Station, so they abandoned Mir. The program was canceled, and of course, Mir was allowed to enter its atmosphere and burn up in 2000. Then when space station was being assembled, in order for components to be safely mated on orbit, they realized they'd have to turn off the power. Well, the crew inside the modules really wouldn't like that. They kind of like the lights on and the air circulating. So we had to come up with a way to dead face those circuits to protect EVA astronauts when they were making connections. And that's what we did. So it was called the circuit isolation devices. We built 8 of them for the space station. You see one of them in the upper right corner when we were processing it for launch. And you see on the bottom left, the circles show the position of 6 of those units attached on the Z1 truss on space station via EVA astronauts. The bottom right is the picture I captioned called Getting Dressed for Work. That's the orbiter processing facility at the Kennedy Space Center. You see the payload bay of the Space Shuttle Discovery. Behind me in what we call a bunny suit there, a clean room garment. You see the shuttle's remote manipulator system, its robot arm behind me. And in the background, you can see the 2 windows of the aft flight deck of the orbiter. On the right, in the grid work there, you will see a white box. That box was getting ready to be placed in the orbiter payload bay, and that contained the first 6 of the circuit isolation devices that were carried to space station. Next chart. Then we built a device called the Floating Potential Probe. The space station orbits a distance above the Earth about the equivalent from Cleveland to Cincinnati, Ohio, a little over 200 miles. So it's actually skirting the upper edges of Earth's atmosphere. And it's very big. It's the size of a football field. So in the same way you develop a static charge by walking across your living room carpet in your stocking feet, and you realize you built up a static charge when you touch something metal and you get a nice static electric shock, the space station is building up a similar charge. But it's so big and it's moving so fast, the charge buildup could destroy a spacecraft or kill an astronaut. Now, the Glenn Research Center built several devices for station called plasma contactors. They emit a charged xenon plasma to act as a ground, to dissipate that charge buildup on station. But there was no way to measure how well they were working. So the Johnson Space Center asked us to build a device to measure that charge buildup, and they needed it in 4 months. So from the time we were turned on to start this activity to the time the astronauts installed it on top of space station, as you can see here, was 4 months. And it did measure the charge buildup of station, which Johnson Space Center was able to use to compare against all of the predictive modeling they had done. And they discovered that their models were completely wrong. So data from the Floating Potential Probe led to revamping the safety procedures for visiting vehicles for EVA astronauts, and actually helped make space station a safer place for the vehicles and for the astronauts. You'll notice a Christmas tree on the back of the Floating Potential Probe. That was on a beta cloth bag that was attached to the unit that carried the solar arrays and the probe arms, because this was actually assembled at the work site on station. This was done by the astronauts who installed it on station. They were carrying on a tradition that is done when a skyscraper is built on Earth. The construction crews will place a fir tree on top of the skyscraper at its highest point above the ground. Well, in this case, where FPP was placed, was the highest point on space station above the Earth. So the astronauts did their own topping off ceremony. Next chart. This is the Space Environments Complex at the Neil Armstrong Test Facility in Sandusky, Ohio. This is the center dome you see there, houses the largest thermal vacuum chamber in the world. It is an all aluminum chamber, 100 feet in diameter, 122 feet tall. It has 2 large 50-foot by 50-foot doors leading in and out of the chamber. The doors that seal this chamber weigh 1 million pounds each. This chamber can be pumped down to the vacuum of space in 8 hours. It can house a cold wall that can simulate the minus 200-degree temperatures of space. It can house heating lamps to simulate the 250-degree plus temperatures that you see in space. This facility also contains, and you see in the upper left there, the world's largest mechanical vibration facility. This can take and vibrate a spacecraft that is 75 feet tall and weighs 75,000 pounds. When a launch vehicle takes off with a spacecraft attached to it, it shakes like crazy. So you have to simulate that vibration load and design a spacecraft to make sure it can handle those vibrations. And of course, you have to test it to make sure it can. A launch vehicle is very noisy too. Any rocket is louder than if you were standing next to the engine on a 747 operating at full thrust. You would be deaf in a millisecond. So we have to yell at a spacecraft because those sound pressure waves can also damage a spacecraft. So we have the most powerful reverberant acoustic test facility in the world as well. And the picture of the facility that you see in the center of this page When a spacecraft comes through that left door into the high bay, it can go into the chamber, undergo thermal vacuum testing. It can undergo electromagnetic interference testing. It can then be wheeled into the other bay, go through the vibration testing, go through the acoustic testing. Then it comes back out and is packaged and is ready to ship to be launched. This is the only place in the world where all of this testing can be done under a single roof. Now, many of you have already seen this facility. If you've seen the very first Avengers movie, that movie starts off at a top secret dark energy facility. Well, that dark energy facility was the Space Environments Complex at the Neil Armstrong Test Facility. The facility that they used was the vacuum chamber. And those are the pictures you see at the bottom of the screen from the Avengers movie. So if you've seen the Avengers, you've seen this facility. Next chart. Some of the programs I've worked on in 38 years that I found very interesting. One was called the Gondola for High Altitude Planetary Science, or GAPS. We were going to build a very large telescope to fly on a high altitude balloon, 130,000 feet above the Earth's atmosphere, and do planetary science, a lot cheaper than sending spacecraft to the planets in the solar system. Unfortunately, the telescope was costing a little bit too much and more than the budgets allowed, so we ended up not doing the program. We then put in a proposal for a constellation of spacecraft to do 3D imaging of clouds to enhance weather prediction. And that mission was called CLOUD, Cloud Observations for Updraft Determination. That was done about 6 years ago. Next chart. I'm also been part of a team at Glenn called COMPASS. COMPASS is what is known as a concurrent engineering design team. What it is subject matter experts that represent all of the subsystem of a spacecraft: structures, mechanisms, propulsion, power, thermal control, communications. And a customer will come in from NASA or even from industry and say, I need a spacecraft to do a certain kind of mission. What would it look like and how much is it going to cost? So we will do a conceptual design for that spacecraft. All of its subsystems will determine how much it's going to weigh, how you're going to operate it, how much it's going to cost to build it and to launch it. We'll create a very detailed report, anywhere from 150 to 300 pages in length, with all of those details. And this is all done in the span of about 2 weeks. COMPASS has been in existence for over 10 years now and has done over 110 different configurations. And if you'd like to see one of those, all you have to do is go to YouTube and do a search for Titan submarine. The picture you see in the bottom center of this is the Titan submarine that we designed to explore the liquid methane seas that exist on Saturn's moon, Titan. So if you go to YouTube, do a search for Titan submarine, you'll see an animation of this submarine in action. Next chart. I was lead systems engineer for an ion propulsion system called NASA's Evolutionary Xenon Thruster, and it was a commercial version of this thruster that is being built by Aerojet Rocketdyne. This thruster is going to be used next year on a spacecraft called DART, the Double Asteroid Redirection Test. It's a test of a planetary protection method. As you know, Earth is a target for all of the leftovers from the creation of the solar system. Meteoroids enter Earth's atmosphere on a daily basis. Sometimes large ones make it to the surface. And NASA tracks a lot of asteroids that are big enough that can actually cause extinction level events on the Earth. Well, one potential way of eliminating the possibility of a impact is to deflect the asteroid by hitting it with something. And the DART mission is actually going to test that. It is going to go to an asteroid near Mars that is called Didymos. And Didymos has another smaller asteroid that orbits it. The DART spacecraft will impact that asteroid to see if it can deflect its orbit around its larger companion, Didymos. So this will be the first flight of this thruster on a very critical mission looking at planetary protection. The patch to the right is for a mission called Psyche. Psyche is being built by the Jet Propulsion Laboratory in Pasadena, California, and a company called Maxar. It is going to a main belt asteroid called Psyche, which is believed to be all metal. It is believed that this asteroid is a part of the metallic core of a planet that never formed, that is responsible for the rubble that we call the main asteroid belt. And this spacecraft will launch in August of next year. It too will be powered by a low thrust propulsion system, an ion propulsion system, different from NextSea. But we provide systems engineering as well as subject matter expert support to that mission. Next chart. I've been working for a while on a program to put a small nuclear fission reactor as a demonstration on the lunar surface. It's called the Fission Surface Power Project. This is the logo that was adopted for the project, again, which I had the pleasure of designing for the project. We're working in concert with the Department of Defense. This system will be a demonstration, but is also intended to provide power to the Artemis base camp as it evolves on the lunar surface. But what it's really intended for is to support human habitats on the surface of Mars. The moon will be used as a demonstration to basically bring out the system, make sure it's working the way we need, and if it's not, to fix what we need to fix to get ready to send it to Mars. Next chart. I'm working a project right now for an organization called the National Oceanic and Partnership Program. We're working on a small spacecraft called Shallows. Shallows stands for the Satellite Hosting Atmospheric and Littoral Ocean Water Sensors. Littoral means the region of a body of water like an ocean, a sea, a lake, or a river that is near the shore. We formed a consortium, which we call the Ohio Partnership for Littoral Research. It consists of the NASA Glenn Research Center, the Air Force Institute of Technology at Wright-Patterson Air Force Base, which is outside Dayton, Ohio, and a principal investigator from the University of Cincinnati. We're in the early phases of this mission. It should launch sometime in the next 3 or 4 years. Next chart. I'm also the lead for some competitions in our University Student Design Challenge. This is where we invite undergraduate students at universities across the country to design a concept mission for NASA, and we help them with that design, and then at the end of it, we choose the winners of the design. Last year, I did one called the Interstellar Explorer mission. This was a mission to design a spacecraft to reach interstellar space in 20 years. We launched the Voyager spacecraft out of the solar system. It took them 40 years to reach interstellar space. So we want to try to cut that time in half. And then their designs had to be able to continue to send data back to Earth for at least 20 more years after crossing into interstellar space. We had 2 university teams competing for that. They both did absolutely outstanding jobs with that. This year, I'm the lead for 2 competitions. One is called the Configurable Solar System Surface Science Exploration System, or COSIS. This is a small mobility system that with minor changes could be sent anywhere in the solar system to do research on the surface, whether it's the moon, Mars, Venus, or the surface of an asteroid. We actually only have 1 university team taking on this challenge, but that team is actually a consortium of 8 different universities spread across the country. The other challenge is for a long-duration Venus explorer. The longest any spacecraft has survived on the surface of Venus was the Russian Venera probes in the early 1970s. And the longest any of them lasted was about 2 hours on the surface. This challenge is to design a spacecraft to survive on the surface of Venus for 90 days in an atmospheric pressure 90 times denser than Earth and a temperature approaching 900 degrees Fahrenheit. It's a challenge for electronics. It's an enormous challenge for materials. But there are 4 university teams competing on this challenge, And they have all come up with utterly outstanding concepts for NASA. Next chart. Let's talk just a little bit about engineers in aerospace, and this includes NASA. There's all kinds of different engineers. There's analytical engineers who analyze data. They often specialize in a particular field, and they work with others to solve problems. Then there are design engineers. They're the people who design spacecraft and aircraft, who design components of spacecraft and aircraft. They work with the analytical engineers. No one does their job by themselves. It is truly a team effort in NASA. Next chart. There are materials engineers who come up with the right materials for the job. Venus is a great example. I can't put anything made out of aluminum on the surface of Venus. It would melt before it even reached the surface. So you have to take into account the environments. You have to take into account launch loads. You have to take into account the stresses of the temperature environments, like the space station in Earth orbit. Every half orbit, it's going from 200 degrees above zero to 250 degrees below zero. And it's been doing that for 20 years. Puts a lot of stress on materials. You have to design that into it. Then there's the systems engineer. That's what I am. I'm a systems engineer. I define a systems engineer as someone who has to know enough about every discipline on a spacecraft to be dangerous to everybody. I have to look at the big picture. Looking at, in my case, a spacecraft, but you also look at an aircraft, which is really a combination of a bunch of smaller subsystems. We have to make sure that all of those subsystems work together, that each one has the resources it needs from other subsystems, that they can handle the environments they're in, everything that goes into the system, everything that crosses lines within the system, and everything that comes out of that system to the environment. We have to look at all of those things. Next chart. Software. There's not a single spacecraft, not a single aircraft, there's not a single car out there that doesn't rely on software. The Perseverance rover on Mars, the Ingenuity helicopter, without software, they couldn't do their jobs. Because they're so far from Earth, we can't control them. They have to control themselves, and that's software. And then manufacturing engineers. It doesn't do any good to design an aircraft or a spacecraft if it can't be built, because there is no such material known as unobtainium. That's the ideal material for building anything, by the way. It has the highest strength, the lowest mass, but it doesn't exist, unfortunately. So you have to make sure from the very beginning, you're talking with manufacturing engineers to make sure you can build what you're designing. Next chart. Then, particularly in the aircraft, aerospace, aeronautics realm, there's flight research engineers. These are the ones that push the envelope. They're the ones that'll put an aircraft through its paces to make sure it does everything it's supposed to do. And then, of course, there's the service engineers. They're doing the maintenance that make sure these aircraft can fly and fly safely. They're the ones who make sure that all our facilities are working properly. Because if they're not, we can't do our jobs. The person who helps keep the lights on in the building and who keeps the grass cut is just as important as the astronauts you see on space station. Because if one of those isn't there, the whole chain falls apart. Next chart. And there are also scientists and technicians. Engineers and scientists are a little bit different. Scientists ask why. They provide the answers to science concepts. Then engineers then say, okay, what can I do with that? So really, one can't live without the other. Scientists typically work in research and development, both in the government, private labs, and academic research. Next chart. And technicians support everybody. They're collecting data, they're analyzing data, they're working in the labs, they're doing all the work to verify scientific concepts and engineering designs. Again, another link in that chain, and without them, the chain falls apart. Next chart. Internet. The internet is, NASA is probably one of the biggest users of the internet. So we need people who are talented internet designers, who can develop World Wide Web pages, understand how to do graphics, understand how to get that information to people. That's how our prime contact with the public is via the internet. Next chart. Lawyers. I'm dealing with our legal office right now for some issues. They help us understand the federal statutes that NASA has to operate under, everything from contract law to environmental law. So they are incredibly important to what we do. Not something you think of when you think of NASA, but they are just as important as the scientists and engineers. Next chart. Politicians. NASA's funding comes from Congress. Everyone listening in tonight, you're all taxpayers. You're paying me. You're paying NASA. You're paying for this presentation. You're welcome, by the way, and thank you. Because without you, we couldn't do what we do. So we have to make sure we can get information to the politicians so they understand what we're doing and why, so they can give us the budgets that we need. Next chart. We have to get information across to everybody, whether it's our peers, our managers, or what I'm doing for you right now. So people who are very talented writers, technical writers, fiction writers, who can get across the work that we're doing are incredibly important to NASA. When I talk to students about careers, I tell them, make sure you can write well, make sure you can speak well, make sure you can do public speaking, because you can be the greatest scientist or engineer in the world. But if you can't get your ideas across, you are useless. Next chart. And art. I'm sure many of you have been to the Air and Space Museum in Washington, D.C., and you see one of the beautiful murals by Bob McCall. Other artists like Pat Rawlings, Paul DeMar, they turn what the concepts that engineers and scientists have into art forms. And the adage that a picture is worth 1,000 words really is true, because you can capture the emotions of spaceflight in a painting much better than you can in a technical document. And even getting that across through music. The gentleman you see in the bottom of this picture is Vangelis. He's composed music for a lot of movies like Chariots of Fire. He composed an arrangement for the Spirit and Opportunity rovers, which he called Methodia. And if you listen to that music and close your eyes, you can just envision these rovers on the surface of Mars, the only thing moving around on the surface of a world. And it really does get the emotion across as to what people who work in this field really feel. Next chart. And astronauts, of course, everybody knows you have mission commanders, pilots, mission specialists, and this will carry through into Orion. It carries through into the crew that we launch on the Dragon spacecraft to the International Space Station. But every astronaut will tell you that they are simply the top of a pyramid, that for every astronaut doing his or her job in space, they may be the most visible, but there are literally thousands of people whose work have allowed them to do the job that they're doing. They're very important. They are risking their lives in what they are doing, and everyone who works to support them understands that and supports them. Again, part of that chain. Next chart. So for any students that are listening, you know, if you're going to become a scientist or an engineer, if you want to work in the aerospace field, work for NASA, your technical classes are very important. But remember this, in going to college, in high school, college, what you're doing is you're putting tools in a toolbox. And what high school and college do not tell you is how to use those tools. You have to figure that out for yourself. And of course, the technical classes you take are very important tools, but they're not the only ones. English, please, please, please learn to communicate, learn to write well, learn to speak well, learn to do presentations. You know, if I can give you a technical presentation to everyone here, I can give us that same technical presentation to my peers, to my managers, and I will tell each of those groups the exact same things, but I'll tell it in different ways. So you have to be able to communicate. You know, if I need an equation to do something that I don't remember, I can pull out my textbooks and pull out the equation. I can pull out my spreadsheets where I have these equations. But if you can't communicate, it really doesn't matter. You've got to be able to get yourself across. Next chart. Remember, when you go to college, you're there for an education. You're not for training. Learn geography. You'll learn history. Be able to converse with people. Learn a foreign language. NASA works with Russia, with Japan, with France, with Germany, with South Korea, with a lot of other countries, with Saudi Arabia. We've had astronauts from all of those countries. So learning a foreign language can be very important. Learning economics, because even engineers have to come up with budgets and we have to come up with schedules. So learning about economics can help you as well. It's all very important. Remember, it's an education. It's not training. Next chart. 2 more tips. I already talked about your communication skills, but be computer literate. Whether it's just your laptop, learning to use Microsoft products, PowerPoint, Word, Excel, learn those things. You use them every day. Stay informed of current events in your field of specialty, whether it's science, technology, aerospace, and again, communication. I can't stress that enough. Be able to communicate well. Next chart. Stay well versed. When you're interviewing for a job, if you have a knowledge base that shows you're up on what you're interested in, what your passion is, you stand a much better chance of getting a job. Next chart. These next series of charts I'm not going to go through in detail. You can get this package from Matthew, but these are all of the websites where if you are in college or even in high school, you can become an intern working for NASA. You can get paid for your job too. Matt, if you just want to slowly flip through the next series of charts, it just gives you the criteria for being an intern, particularly if you're in high school. The listings are here for the websites. There's a recent graduates program, which helps you get your career started. And odds are, if you become an intern and you're invited back a second time for an internship, odds are you're going to be offered a job with NASA. There's also opportunities for veterans as well to work for NASA as an intern. And actually, NASA will pay you to get an advanced degree. You just have to agree to work for NASA for a number of years afterwards. So these charts here give you some of these websites that you can go to find out about these opportunities. This is for the professional opportunities that are available. NASA posts all of its jobs on the USA Jobs website, so you can search every NASA center for positions, including pathways internships that are available. NASA also has a NASA Jobs website, which has links to USA Jobs, and it gives more background information on the jobs and internships that are available at NASA. And this is the student opportunities page. You see the address there at the top of the page. And this is the one-stop shopping initiative, where every single internship at every single NASA center is posted. And by clicking on those, searching those, clicking on the specific ones, you can get all the specifics for applying for an internship across NASA. And now this chart here gives you an idea of how much you can be paid if you work for NASA. Typically, if you graduate college with a bachelor's degree in engineering, you'll start on the general schedule or GS schedule, which is divided into 15 grades. Each grade is divided into 10 steps. You start out at a GS7 step 1, which currently is about $45,500. When I started 38 years ago, that salary level was $21,500. So you can see the effects of inflation over the years. The longer you work at NASA, you accrue more vacation time. Since I've been there more than 15 years, I actually get over a month of paid vacation every year. And in addition to that, every 2 weeks, you earn 4 hours of sick leave. So you can literally earn thousands of hours of sick leave over your career. And in addition to the salary here, the government makes contributions to your retirement, your health insurance premiums, your life insurance premiums, and your Medicare. And all of these come to about an additional 10 to 20% of the gross pay that you see here. You don't see the money because these premiums are paid for you by the government. But if you did get the money, you could add 10 to 20% to the salary levels you see here. And I think that that is my last chart, Matt. Yes, it is. All right. I appreciate everyone's listening, and we'll turn it over to questions, Matt. So the ball's back to you.
Oh, thank you so much. That was absolutely fascinating. And I see some folks are adding questions in the Q&A. That's great. I'm going to start off here with some that were submitted throughout the session. First question that came in was a question about whether or not it's possible to tour those facilities in Ohio.
You can actually tour them virtually. If you go to www.nasa.gov, you can follow the links there to the Glenn Research Center, and they are doing virtual facility tours. So you can sign up for those. There are also a lot of virtual events going on now, and as a matter of fact, competitions, because this is our 80th anniversary. So that celebration is underway as well. So there are a number of activities associated with it. So if you go to nasa.gov and follow the links to the Glenn Research Center, you can find out all about those things.
Excellent. Thank you for that information. That's wonderful. Okay, next question. Is there anything you can tell us about a mission to Mars? And if so, how are you involved?
Right now, the closest I'm coming to a mission to Mars is the Fission Surface Power Project, which is intended for the surface of Mars. I may be working with actually NASA headquarters. I had my first meeting today. They're looking at a potential system to deliver a Mars ice mapper mission to orbit around Mars that would use solar electric propulsion. So I may be involved in that, but I literally had my first meeting on that one today.
Great. That's exciting. All right. Let's see here. You mentioned the teamwork that is required at NASA, and we're wondering if you could share maybe about a coworker of yours who stands out in your mind as being particularly brilliant or having solved some problem that you were really impressed with.
The first thing comes to my mind is when I was working on the two weather satellites that we launched for NOAA. Of course, I was working on the launch vehicle side, so I was working with our launch vehicle project office at the center here in Cleveland, working with the contractor, but I was also working with the Goddard Space Flight Center because they were the ones who were actually building the spacecraft for NOAA, and they in turn had their contractor they were working with. And the gentleman I worked with at Goddard was a gentleman by the name of Bob DeFazio. Was an absolute pleasure to work with. We had a situation where it really didn't matter what badge you were wearing, what NASA center you were with, whether you were with a contractor or not. We were working together to the same goals. And we did our job so well. We had a schedule to follow when certain things had to be done, and we were 6 or 7 months ahead of that schedule. We managed to work very, very well together on that mission. A lot of times there can be difficulty working between NASA centers because every center is very competitive, as you can imagine. They all try to be on top. And when you're working with a contractor, of course, a contractor's prime reason for existence is to make money, and you have to monitor the work they do very carefully. And you do your best to avoid any adversarial relationships. And we had problems, and we managed to work them well together because we functioned very well as a team. And I have to admit, I in 38 years, that was the only time that I can say that I've been able to work in that type of an environment. It was just an absolute pleasure.
That's awesome. Yeah, that is very memorable. That's excellent. Was there ever a point along your career where you thought you might want to give up? Any challenge that you were facing, any problem you were trying to solve that you thought, I don't know if we're going to get this one?
Oh gosh. I've worked on proposals where we've spent a year putting a proposal together. We didn't win them. Um, but has there ever been a situation where I wanted to say, that's enough, I quit? No. And the reason for that is, as I said in the beginning, I'm a space cadet. I'm doing the job I wanted to do from the time I was 6 years old. There's a lot of headaches. There's a lot of grief. One of the reasons I do outreach like this is it helps remind me of why I started working for NASA to begin with. And you have to deal with the politics, you have to deal with the budgets, you have to deal with the technical questions. Doing things like this is actually kind of regenerating for me. So there's a selfish reason for doing this as well. But it's also my way of giving back. If you remember, I mentioned I used to correspond with Glenn Lunny, one of the Apollo flight directors. So this is my way of giving back. And if in talks like this, if I can get through to a single person or one kid manages to go on and work for NASA, then I've been successful.
That's wonderful. That's wonderful. Here's a question that will be fun to hear your answer to. What is your response to those who believe that the moon landing was a hoax?
Go to the website for the Lunar Reconnaissance Orbiter. It has been in orbit around the moon since 2009, doing mapping of the lunar surface, high resolution photography. It has photographed all of the Apollo landing sites in a resolution enough where you can see the equipment the Apollo astronauts left on the surface. You can see their footprint trails in the lunar regolith. You can see the descent stages of the lunar module. Also, the majority of the Apollo missions left laser retroreflectors, basically very reflective mirrors on the surface of the moon. And we use them to this day. We bounce lasers off those to measure down to a few centimeters the distance from the Earth to the moon. All that hardware is still there. We photographed it. And of course, if anyone still doesn't believe it, they could do what a gentleman did a few years ago and confront Buzz Aldrin and ask him to swear on a Bible that he walked on the moon, and they can get the same punch in the mouth that he gave that man.
Excellent. Thank you for responding to that. You mentioned this project that they asked you to put together, and then they said, oh yeah, we need that in 4 months. Yeah. Are there any other really quick turnarounds that have stood out in your mind that you were amazed that it came together in that amount of time?
That was the quickest one that I've ever worked on. During actually the execution of that mission, that was the first set of solar arrays that were installed on Space Station. And of course, they were going to put us on top of that truss after those arrays were deployed. Well, on that mission, when they went to deploy the arrays, they got stuck. So they had to plan an emergency EVA and come up with tools to help the astronauts deploy those arrays. So they weren't sure if they were going to deploy us or not. They wanted to leave us in a different position on Space Station. And I was on console for that mission, and we had not analyzed, for instance, docking loads and EVA loads for this new position. So I was actually holding back, giving them to go to do that, waiting for information from them, and they were getting rather testy with me. Fortunately, the astronauts got those solar arrays deployed. They came back to the station airlock, they recharged their backpacks, and they took our hardware, crawled up that truss, and installed it. The installation was supposed to take 3 hours. They did it in an hour and a half. Wow. So they did manage to get it done in time. But when you're doing mission planning, you plan for contingencies like that. And you know you've done your job. If a mission goes the way it's supposed to, it actually feels like a letdown because you had nothing to do. Everything worked. You know, you plan for all these contingencies and you're ready for all these things to go wrong and nothing does. So it's kind of like an adrenaline letdown. You know, working on any space mission is years or decades of boredom followed by moments of sheer terror. But it's those moments of terror that make it worthwhile.
Yeah, that's terrific. How has NASA or your job changed most in the 38 years that you've been there?
It's changed quite a bit. The center here in Cleveland has changed quite a bit. NASA has become very, very risk averse over the years, to the point of almost becoming too risk averse. You know, everything we do is the old adage, we're pushing the envelope, whether it's in aeronautics or space. I think we may be getting that back a little bit. One of the things I think that's an aid for NASA is the fact that, you know, space is not a fledgling industry anymore. You know, NASA has always used contractors to build aircraft and spacecraft, always. Right back to Mercury, Gemini, Apollo, they were all built by contractors. Well, those contractors now have the smarts where we don't have to look over their shoulder. We don't have to buy a launch vehicle. We can buy a launch service. We can rely on SpaceX to launch our astronauts to the International Space Station. We don't have to control every aspect of it anymore. So that allows NASA to actually focus its funding in other areas. It allows us to consider building those first permanent bases on the moon, which will get us to the first human exploration of Mars.
Yeah, that's incredible. And you've mentioned there something, another question that was asked was about this idea of NASA working with outside entities. And the question came specifically is NASA working with Elon Musk at all?
Oh, yeah, I've been through the SpaceX facility. It is a marvelous facility they have. Their spacecraft have been tested in that vacuum chamber out at our Armstrong test facility. They are an incredibly capable organization. And if you want to talk about a group that is pushing the envelope, they certainly are. NASA tried several times to do reusable launch vehicles and failed miserably. SpaceX has succeeded in doing it, and they show it every time they launch a Falcon 9 and recover those boosters. I think they've used boosters up to 9 times now. This last crew mission that launched on a used car, because the Dragon capsule named Endeavour is the same one that took the first demonstration crew to space station. So we're even reusing the spacecraft. So it's an enormous change in how NASA works, but I honestly think it's a change for the better.
That's fantastic and very exciting to hear. And we have another question here came in about this idea of reusing materials, I think, and it was directed to you. They said, "Thank you, Mr. Woytach." And Karen writes, "Your senior thesis was titled Utilization of the Space Shuttle's External Tanks as a Manned Orbital Facility." She thinks that she has that correct. And her question was, did your thesis support or negate the possibility for their reuse? And why did that never come to fruition?
It definitely supported it, because when the space shuttle launched, when the external tank was jettisoned, of course, the external tank provided the propellants for the main engines on the orbiter. When it was jettisoned, it would, of course, burn up in the atmosphere over the Indian Ocean. But it was at about 98% of orbital velocity when it was jettisoned. It was actually slowed by venting the remaining propellants in the tank to slow it down so it would enter the atmosphere. Well, if those remaining propellants were burned in the orbiter, it was able to be placed in orbit. And it already had built-in hatches for accessing those tanks on the ground. They could have been modified to access them for space, where you could have gotten in there and added accommodations to actually turn that tank into a space station, because that tank was 28 feet in diameter and about 70 feet long. So quite a nice size volume for an orbital facility. Unfortunately, that idea was never adopted by NASA. It was looked at, but building an orbital facility requires an enormous amount of money. And that's why NASA went with the International Space Station, because you have not only modules there from the United States, but also from Russia, from Japan, and from the European Space Agency, all partnered on the space station.
Yeah, excellent. The next question is about the space station, sort of. And the question is, have you ever seen the movie Gravity? And that's the one with Sandra Bullock.
Unfortunately, yes. Yeah.
And the question is, if so, how accurate was that depiction of how an astronaut would work on the space station?
Not those opening sequences with George Clooney flying around in the MMU. No. Just the way, I mean, they violated the laws of physics. I can't tell you how many times in that movie. And you're not going to go from the space station to a Russian vehicle to a Chinese vehicle and be able to fly them. It's not going to happen, folks. It's not going to happen. If you want a movie that is a bit truer to spaceflight, The Martian, where the astronaut was stranded on Mars, that takes some liberties, but they can be forgiven. Apollo 13 with Tom Hanks was a very well done movie. There are some things in it that are played up, of course, for the drama of a movie, and some things are out of sequence, but it is very accurate. If you would like to see a very good realistic movie dealing with a space station, there was a movie made back in 1968. It starred Gregory Peck and David Janssen. It was called Marooned. It's about a group of astronauts that go to a space station and they cannot fire the engines on their spacecraft to come back to Earth. So they're marooned. And it's about the rescue efforts for those astronauts. It is a very well done movie. It was made in 1968. And of course, if you really want to see a very accurate movie, 2001, A Space Odyssey.
Excellent. Oh, thank you. Just two more questions. Second to last is, how big is the Kennedy Space Center?
What we call the Kennedy Space Center is actually two different facilities. It's, of course, the Kennedy Space Center, which maintains facilities for integrating payloads for Orion, integrating the Orion spacecraft, the space station processing facility, where everything we send to space station is processed. It has two launch complexes, Complex 39, A and B, and the very large vehicle assembly building. All of the other launch pads, for instance, complexes 36 and 40 that are being used by SpaceX, the complexes that will be used by Blue Origin, etc., are part of Cape Canaveral Space Force Station, which is adjacent to the Kennedy Space Center. They're all on Merritt Island, which is a national wildlife preserve. So when you're driving through there, you've got to worry about everything from armadillos to alligators. And believe me, I've had a few instances with some of the inlets around the vehicle assembly building where you've kind of walked very quickly away from them because alligators were sunning themselves on the banks. So they used to have to scare the wild pigs off the shuttle landing facility before the shuttle land. So it's a wildlife refuge. There are two very large eagles nests in proximity to the vehicle assembly building. I think if you go to their website, they have cameras on those areas, so you can actually see the eagles there.
That's incredible. Our last question comes from Maddie, who is 7, and she wants to know if you have any funny stories you could share.
Yeah, first one, again, of those two GOES missions that I worked, I had to write a computer program to process telemetry from the Centaur upper stage and convert it into data that the spacecraft could use. They needed information on how the stage was oriented in space when the spacecraft separated from it. And the program was put on the computers in the Launch Vehicle Data Center at, it was then Cape Canaveral Air Force Station. And I'm sitting at a console and I'm waiting for the data to come down, and I hit the buttons for my program to run, and it's running very slowly. And I'm like, what is going on? The spacecraft needs this data, and they need it within minutes. And finally, the data comes up. Everything was fine. It was within nominal. I called them, gave them I faxed them the information. Everything was fine. Afterwards, I talked to the gentleman who ran the facility, And I was asking to him, why was the data so slow coming up? And he took me into the back room where all of these consoles were patched in. Understand, this is a facility that was built in 1941. Okay, it still had analog systems. And they didn't have a lot of budget for computers. So this isn't going to mean too much to you, Maddie, being 7 years old. But talk to your, I'm going to say your grandfather, and ask him if he remembers what a Commodore 64 computer was. That's what my program was running on. And that's why it was so slow. It was your cell phone today has about 10,000 times the computing power that computer had. So it was just cranking and cranking and cranking, and I'm pulling out my hair. And it was just kind of funny. And I just told him, I said, thank you for not telling me that this was going to happen before the mission. Otherwise, I would have completely lost it.
Oh, well, thank you so much for your time in responding to those questions and for a fascinating presentation. And again, we are so thankful that you joined us tonight.
Well, thank you, Matthew. I appreciate it. I appreciate the invitation. Thank you to everybody for listening. And as I said, you can get all these charts from Matthew, and my email address is there. If you have any other questions, feel free to send me an email. I will definitely respond.
Yeah, and again, this session is being recorded, and so that'll be posted on our program archive on our website, along with the slides from tonight. And I'm going to go ahead and draw our winner for our awesome swag bag, and the winner is Jen. So you can pick up your awesome NASA swag next time you stop in at the library. Want to make you all aware of an event we have coming up a week from tonight. Tonight we've heard a lot about NASA and this great information about space exploration. Next week we're going to depart from reality, as we will be hosting Dan Zare, who is a Star Wars expert, and he's going to be presenting on Star Wars and the Hero's Journey, a literary adventure. He has just published a book on Star Wars, and he's going to be sharing with us some of the mythological foundations of Star Wars and how that all works out in literature. So we'd invite you to come back next Tuesday at 6:30, and we'll be hearing from him. And that, of course, is on May the 4th. And so we'll be back on next week. From all of us here at the library, once again, Mr. Woytach, thank you so much for your time. And thank you everyone who tuned in. And if you ever have any questions, let us know. We're always here to help. Thanks again.
All right, thanks again, and congratulations, Jen. Have a good evening, everyone.
Yes, all right, bye-bye. Keep on reading.